Okay, so this is episode 4 of the Creating an MVC Project Soup to Nuts series, and we'll be creating data sources to consume the stored procedures that we created in the previous video. And as always, just as a reminder, these videos are targeted at junior developers looking for a starting off point, and I'm assuming that the viewer has a firm understanding of the C# language and object-oriented design principles. So this time around, it's going to get a little bit real here. So what we're going to do is we are going to implement a pattern for consuming the stored procedures that we made in the previous video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the pattern to you, and then I'm going to show us how to do it the repetitive way. And then we're going to go back and refactor that code to make sure that we aren't repeating ourselves too much as we go forward. So the pattern that I like to use when I'm not using Entity Framework, which, by the way, if you've looked at the notes, we are deliberately not using Entity Framework because I don't want to inundate anybody with having to learn the details and inner workings of that. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use ADO and do this sort of old school, but using a nice clean pattern. So generally what I like to do is I like to create data sources for each individual proc, which follows somewhat of a simplified command pattern. So each class that we create is going to serve a purpose, and the only purpose that is to call that stored procedure, receive the data, and then map that data into a domain object for us to use. Okay. So first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to create the data DTOs, and I'm going to kind of explain a little bit more about that as we go on here. So in my object layer here, which we described earlier, which would house all of our objects that are not view models, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder called data DTO. You can call this anything that you want. But what this is going to contain is this is going to contain specialized objects that model exactly what's being returned from the database. These are not domain objects, and these are not service contract serializable objects. These are simply data transfer objects that are built specifically to model the data being returned from the database. And this is the only place that these objects are going to be used. And I'll talk more about why that is later. But so right off the bat, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a data class for the employee that we created earlier. So I'm just going to create a new class. We're going to call it employee data. Okay, the naming convention that I tend to follow is that any of these objects that are just there for modeling database data, I suffix them with the word data. And I'll just continue to talk about my naming conventions as we go on. But we'll call this one employee data. And we'll just make it a public class. And this is going to, like I said earlier, this is going to contain exactly all the same data that we saw in our database before. So just so we have something to work off of, I'll go ahead and look at the columns here. We have employee ID, first name, last name, hire date, end date, position ID, and department ID. We are going to model exactly that. So I'll say prop string first name, and I'm already forgetting that ID like I do every single time. So we'll call that int employee ID. Prop string, last name. And then we'll say date, time, hire date. And then we'll say date, time, and date. And then int for position ID. And int for department ID. Alright. Excuse me. So this is exactly the data that's being returned from the database. So we're just going to go ahead and save that. And I'm going to go ahead and close that. So now we have a class that's ready to catch that data, right? So now we're going to go to our data layer, and we are going to create another folder called data source. And in that folder, we're going to create our first data source. And that data source is going to be for retrieving all of the employees in the database. So we'll just call this get all employees source. Okay. Now, like I said, the only purpose of this class is only going to perform one function because it's a simplified command pattern type class. So we're going to call that one function is going to be called execute. Okay, so we're going to create a method here that's going to be called execute. Just stub this out real quick. Execute, and we don't even know what's going to go into it yet. Okay. So when we get all employees, currently right now, we don't need any arguments, right? So we won't take any arguments. But we're going to be returning a list of those employees. Okay, so again, we're returning data objects, right? So those objects are not going to be domain objects. It's just going to be the data objects. So we are down in the data layer right now, in the actual data source layer, which is right above our actual persistence layer, which is our database. So we're going to leave that in the data object form. We're not going to do any remapping at this level. We're going to fill the object and we're going to return it back. Okay, so that means that if we're going to get all employees, we're going to need a list. The return type is going to be a list of employee data, right? Cool. So now we need to be able to talk to the database. So to talk to our database, we have to do a number of different things. We have to establish a connection object, command object, get a connection string, and all that stuff. So I'm just going to kind of plot through this and talk about what I'm doing. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to create a connection object. So let me just type this out and we'll talk about it. So SQL connection, this and that. Okay. Oops. New. Okay, so the SQL connection object is really what's going to take care of opening up the connection to the database itself. It takes one parameter, and it is an external resource, so we want to make sure that we're managing that resource correctly. So by using a using statement, what this will do is at the end, right here before we hit the closing bracket, it will call the dispose method of the SQL connection, which will do a number of different things. It'll close the connection, it'll release the commands, it'll get it out of memory, all that stuff. All nice and clean. So the one parameter that the SQL connection actually takes for the constructor is the connection string, and it can take some credentials, but we're just going to talk about the connection string. The connection string is basically you tell it where the database is and where the database server is and which database you're actually going to use. So there's a number of different ways you can implement this. We're going to go incrementally. So if you don't know the format for the connection string for your database, you can look it up by going here to connectionstrings.com. I'm using SQL Server 2012, so I'm just going to copy and paste this string format directly out of there, right? So we'll just say just like that, except with less blood. Where did we screw up here? There. Take all the spaces out. So generally speaking here, I guess I'll show you my server is located on WinServe 01, and it is the SQL 01 instance. The database that we are going to connect to is employee database, which is this guy right here. And why is that a bad compile time constant? Well, because we have a backslash. Okay, so you gotta make sure to escape your stuff here. My username is my administrator username, and my password is none of your business. So we'll go like this. Okay. Now, what I'm gonna do is we're gonna have to use this several more times. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull this out into like a constants file. Generally, what I would do if I had several environments that I had to publish this through, I would do it in the registry. But for the sake of this, we're just gonna go ahead and do it in a constants. So I will go out here and create a new class called application constants. And one of the things I'll put in here will be a string of database connection string. And this is actually going to be a constant. So we'll say public const string. Okay. And then we'll take this whole string out. put it here, right? So now in here, I can just reference that directly. Just put in there. So now we can say application constants.database connection string. So that way we have it in the central point. So when we use it in our other data sources, we'll just hit it directly. And now, let's see here. What I'm going to do is I am going to pause this video real quick and go put my actual password in there. I'll be right back. And we're back. So, okay, so we have our connection object here. We have our connection string. And that should be able to talk to our database. Okay, now the next thing that we're going to need is our command object. So we'll see SQL command. Come here, man. There we go. And this takes two arguments. One of it is the actual command text, and the other one is the connection object, which we created before. So we can reference it directly. Same thing. It's in a using statement, so it'll properly dispose of itself, and it does it recursively. So that's nice. So now the command text really depends on what command type, what command mode that you're going to use. So you can either do actual SQL, where you can actually go right in here and say select all from whatever, blah, 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 and that's what it'll send to the database. But we're using stored procedures, so we're not going to do that. We're actually going to put the name of our stored procedure. So we are doing the get all employees. So if we remember, actually we don't need to look at this one. We can go over here. If you go to programmability, stored procedures, here's all the stuff that we made in the previous video, right? So employees select all, there is the name of our procedure. So we can go ahead and type that in right here. So we'll say USP employee select all, right? And just to be safe, we'll put our schema name in there too. So we have DBO USP employee select all. So we're going to call this rep there. Okay. Now, like I mentioned earlier, you can either do actual SQL command text, or you can do the stored procedures, and we're doing the stored procedures. So we need to make sure that we're telling our command that our command type is of type stored procedure. So you can do text, which is your query strings, table direct, and stored procedure. Use stored procedure right there. Okay. Now the next thing that we're going to have to do is open the connection. So we're going to go ahead and say take the connection object, tell it to open. Okay. Now we need to execute the stored procedure, but we have parameters that we may have to feed it. In this particular case, we don't have parameters, so we're not going to send anything, but we'll get to that in the next data source. For now, what we're going to do is just go ahead and execute it directly. So we'll say do another using statement, RDR for reader. We'll call our command object, and we'll say execute reader. Okay. Now what that's going to do is that's going to actually execute this against the database, and it's going to return a reader object, which we can then go record for record and read the information out of it. Okay. So now that we have the reader object, we have to say we need to be able to iterate through it. So we're going to say while the reader can read, do this stuff. Okay, so what we're going to actually do is we're going to create a list of employees, record by record. So first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll add a list. We'll call it result, and it'll be a new list. A new list of employee data, and we're just going to add to that as we go. So for each reader, we're going to read that record. So we're going to say we'll say employee equals new employee data, right? And then we'll use the object initializer. So we'll go ahead and fill the properties directly. So the first thing is the employee ID, right, which is in this dictionary somewhere. So this data set that they return us is actually a dictionary type, so you hit it by name. So the name of the employee ID, if you look over here, this should tell you the results, not as parameters. So we are returning the entire employee, so we'll just go look directly at this. So the employee ID is the name of the column is employee ID, right? So this actually gives an object. This is why it's giving you a cast problem here. So we need to turn this into an int, and there's a couple ways you can do this. Object is like clay to me, so you can actually just say int and cast it directly to that, right? And then we can say first name is in here under first name, and it's an object, so we can call the toString and actually make it a string. Last name is last name toString. What else we got? We got hire date. Okay, so we got hire date equals reader, and it's called hire date. But again, we need to get this casted somehow, right? So we'll say date time, like so, and then end date should one ever be returned. RDR. It's called end date, right? And then we have the position ID, which is gonna be an int position ID, and then we have the department ID, also going to be an int position ID, and that's it. That's our whole object. So then we'll do this, and we'll add this to the collection. Result.add this employee. And what this will do is it'll loop through every record that was returned, and it will perform this against that record. So each reader is an actual instance of iData record, which is really just this data set here, which is indexed through a string. So that's how we can hit it. So it'll just keep building employee objects based on the results. Okay, so that's our list. So now that we're done with that, we can actually return. We can say return result. So whatever it did in this big chunk of garbage here, it will read all the way through the database and send it back, right? So now we have this one thing called execute. So now we can call that on each data source. Okay, so before we move on here, I want to talk a little bit about this guy right here. This is a perfect instance for perfect scenario for writing something to help you be better off with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create sort of a helper class to sort of clean this up here. So I might get a little bit intermediate, but just bear with me, okay? I'm going to go ahead and go create a new class right in the root directory here, and I'm just going to call it extensions. And I'm going to make this a static class, and I'm going to write an extension method. If you don't know what extensions methods are, go Google it and learn about it. Just don't overdo them, don't abuse them. I think this is a good instance for this because it's a repetitive operation against an object we do not own. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say public static t, and I'm going to say what am I going to say? I'm going to say database2 of type t, and this started with this, and I'm going to apply this to iData record, and I'm going to call this the reader, right? So now what's happening here is I created a generic method. This is going to create an extension method that will be attached to all instances of iData record, and this t right here is really just giving us, it's saying that I don't know what the data type is that I'm asking for, but I will whatever you actually put in here is what this is going to end up being. That's kind of hard to understand right now, but we'll keep pressing. Okay, so one other thing, we're going to add one more parameter, and we'll call it the column name, right? So this is the name of the column. So this column name is going to correspond to what we've been plugging in here. So now what I'll do is I'll say, we're going to go ahead and pull the object out, right? So we'll call this obj, and we'll say reader at column name. Okay, so that basically, this is going to replace this bit right here. Okay, and now we're going to go ahead and do the cast. Okay, so now we're going to say return, I'm going to say, and we'll just do a direct cast like this. Okay, so now this extension method is going to replace this. Now this isn't a solve all for everything because this doesn't account for nullable types, but we'll come back to that at another time. But right now we're going to use this to clean up some stuff, get rid of that stuff. So now we can simplify this whole thing. Employee ID, right? So we can say reader dot database2. Oh, hey, look at that. Int, and the name of the field is employee ID. So we just clean that up. It's a little less confusing. I mean, we still have to type some stuff in there, but whoop-de-doo, right? First name, we'll say reader database to string called first name. Wunderbar. Okay, reader dot database to string last name. See this dirty nasty cast here? Date time higher date, right? Database to date time higher date. And this is end date. So boom. Database to date time end date. And database to int mission ID. Database to int department ID. Okay, so that cleaned that up a bit. And the nice thing is now, next time we go through here, that this extension class will be there for us, and we can simplify that a bit more. Okay, so now we have a data source that can go off and call that stored procedure. Okay, well, we don't have any employees in there yet, so I guess we can just take this opportunity to go ahead and create another data source. So we'll say class, we'll say insert employee source. That sounds good. Okay, and we'll follow the same pattern. We'll say public, and we're going to insert a new employee, so I don't really have anything to return, but we'll say int. Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll return the resulting employee ID. Okay, so we'll say public int execute, and well, we need the employee. This is our thing that we're going to insert, right? And let's be more generic about this, and let's just call it input. Okay. And basically, we're going to do most of the same stuff. So if we remember right, we'll create our connection, SQL connection, application constants, database connection strings. We made that earlier. And we're going to create our command. Oops, SQL command. And this wants the command text. And if we remember over here, the insert, USP employee insert. USP employee insert. Cool. And then the actual connection object. Okay, so we want to say command type, and this is a stored procedure. And oh, we have parameters this time, right? So this employee insert actually has parameters that are required, all that stuff. So now we need to populate the parameters object of our command object. Okay. So generally, the basic way to do this, and we're going to clean this up later, is we're going to say command parameters, and then we'll add a parameter, which is a new SQL parameter. The name of the parameter is first one is first name, right? Now the type of the parameter is nvarchar, right? And then the value, I can't remember if we have a constructor for value. No, we do not. So we will put the initializer value, and that's going to be from our input object, first name. Boom, there's our first parameter. Neat. So we'll go ahead and do the same thing for last name. I'll just copy and paste most of this. Last name, all the same stuff, except for this is last name. Right, now we have the hire date, but this is an actual date time now. So we'll use that. And we'll take the hire date object. And then we have position ID, right? Position ID, and that is an int. And this will be position ID like that. And then we have department ID. Department ID. Okay, so that's all of our parameters. Just added all of those in there. So these are going to get passed through to the actual stored procedure itself. That's why these have to be in alignment all the time. Okay, so that's our command. But we also have an output parameter, right? Employee ID. So this one's a little bit different. We'll say employee ID. It's of the type int, but we're not going to give it a value because it's going to give us the value, right? So we're going to say direction equals output so that it knows this is an output. So what will happen is these parameters will get sent into the database, and the database, when it's done, it will fill in this employee ID in the output, and then that will basically essentially pass by reference here. So when we're done executing this collection of parameters, this actual parameter here, employee ID, will contain the output of that stored procedure. So let's go ahead and call it. So now from here, what we're going to say is we're going to take our command, or we're going to execute a non-query, and this is going to return an integer, right? You can see right here. The integer is it's overloaded. It really depends on the settings of the database, but generally I don't modify anything. So it'll return a -1 if there was a problem, and it'll return a 0 if nothing was updated. Like if I tried to insert and for whatever reason it didn't throw an exception, but it also didn't save my record. It'll return 0, and I think it's 1 if it's successful, but it might be -1. That's neither here or there. What we're really concerned about is that it's not 0. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say if that query returned 0, not 9, 0, if that happens, we're going to go ahead and throw a new, we'll say application exception, and we'll say the record not saved. Good enough for me for now. Okay. If that doesn't happen, then we'll continue on. So one of the things we want to do is get the employee ID out so that we can return it here, so that if we need to query it in the next operation, we can. So let's go ahead and dig that ID out. So we'll say command parameters, and we want to look in all of them. So let's see here. How does this thing store? I think it's indexed. Yeah, I believe so. I think it's indexed. Parameter. Yep. Yeah, look at that. So we can say employee ID. Right. We want to dig that out. So I want to call this employee ID, and we'll dig that out, and we want the value. Right. That's going to give us an object. Right. Object. Yeah. So we want this as an int. Okay. Just cast that to an int. Okay. And then we will return that emp ID. So what we have here is we're starting to see some repeated code. So if we were to do another instance of, or sorry, another class, another data source, we'd have to do all this connection stuff again. And then for everything that's a non-query, we'd have to do all this over again. And we don't want to do that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this code and we're going to clean it up. And we are going to abstract it. We're going to pull all this into a couple base classes, and it's going to get a little bit complicated. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here. But just to recap, what we did is we created data sources, one class that performs one function. In this case, all this does is get a list of employees from the database. In this instance over here, we're actually going to insert something into the database, right? So we showed an example where we need parameters and another example where we don't need parameters. So I don't have a test project set up here, but essentially what you would do is you would new this up, and then you would call execute, and it would do all this, and really all you care about is it gives you back a list of employees. But we don't have anything in there yet, so we'll get to that. So I'm going to stop the video, we'll come back, and we will abstract this and clean it up.